What is going on, everybody? What is going on, the Catch fam? My name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we are hopping into must-start wide receivers for Week 15 of the 2022 fantasy football season. These are going to be wide receivers that you absolutely need to plug into your lineups in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Obviously, wide receivers like Devontae Adams or Stephon Diggs will not make today's list. These are kind of lower tier guys that you may be considering benching over other guys, but these players have phenomenal matchups and, like I said, are considered must starts in my eyes in the first round of the playoffs. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in, hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you're new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, first up, we've got Keenan Allen and Mike Williams of the Chargers going up against the Tennessee Titans, the team that allows the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position overall. This matchup is just unfair to have here in the first round of the playoffs. Keenan Allen had 21.2 fantasy points in Week 14 against the Miami Dolphins, 14 targets, 12 receptions, and 92 receiving yards. Since his return from injury, he's had 12.4 or more fantasy points in every single matchup in full PPR scoring. He has 2 touchdowns in his last 4 games. Mike Williams, on the other hand, looked great in his return from injury with 23.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, caught all 6 of those balls for 6 receptions, 116 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He had a monster day. If Keenan Allen and Mike Williams could both have double digits against the Miami Dolphins in Week 14, there's no reason why they can't do so against the Tennessee Titans in Week 15. I can't emphasize how much I love both of these players as a start this week. And if you need a deeper flex option, you can even consider Joshua Palmer going up against the Titans as well. Really, there's no reason whatsoever why the Chargers would take the foot off of the gas, so to speak. This offense is going to need to put up points in this matchup. The Chargers are in a position where they need to win as many football games as possible to secure a playoff spot. We look at what the Jaguars did last week offensively to the Tennessee Titans through the air. I see no reason why both Keenan Allen and Mike Williams will not come out of Week 15 with monster weeks. All right, next up on the list, we've got Garrett Wilson, who will face the Detroit Lions, the team that allows the 3rd most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. Since Week 8 of the season, Garrett Wilson has had 13.8 or more fantasy points in all of his matchups, excluding Week 11 against the New England Patriots, which was a game that just literally had no offense in it. When we look at the last 3 weeks, Wilson has had 78 or more receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games. Overall, he's just been really solid. A little bit of a lower ceiling last week, but really since Mike White has been the primary quarterback for this Jets unit, he has looked really good overall. And the news is that Mike White is more than likely going to play, according to Mike White, here in Week 15. So we'll kind of see what happens there. But if Mike White suits up, I especially like Garrett Wilson. And even if he doesn't, I just really like Garrett Wilson. This is going to be a game script where both of these teams are going to need to throw the football a lot. And this is a game where both of these teams are going to want to come out with a win, both of these teams in the playoff hunt. So I love Garrett Wilson this week. He's had a really nice second half of the fantasy season. I think he's going to finish out the fantasy playoffs really strong, starting here in Week 15. Next up on the list, we've got DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, who will face the San Francisco 49ers. When we think of this 49ers defense, we think of a really good defense, and that's absolutely fair. But the weakest part of that Niners defense is the secondary. They've given up the 10th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position on the season. And DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett have been on an absolute roll this year with a very improved Seahawks offense under quarterback Geno Smith. Metcalf is your wide receiver 13 on the season. Tyler Lockett is your wide receiver 8 on the season. They get a great matchup against the Niners, and you could also maybe assume that this is going to be a game where the Seahawks are going to have to keep things competitive and throw the football against a good Niners squad. DK Metcalf, 18.1 fantasy points in week 14, 10 targets, 5 receptions, 71 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Since week 3 of the season, DK Metcalf has had 13.1 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for weeks 6 and 7. He has played really good football since week 8. He has had 13.1 or more fantasy points in every single matchup. He's had 18.1 or more fantasy points in the last 3 weeks. On the other hand, Tyler Lockett has had a phenomenal season. He only has 2 games this season where he has finished under double-digit fantasy points. In the last 3 weeks, he's had 15.8 or more fantasy points in every matchup. He's had a touchdown in every game since week 8. That makes 6 touchdowns in his last 6 performances. He was on bye week in week 11. Lockett is just balling, man. Like I said, your wide receiver 8 on the season, and Metcalf is playing very, very well. This is a good matchup for both Lockett and Metcalf. It should be no question that they are in your starting lineups in the first round of the fantasy playoffs. Next up, we've got Christian Watson, who may be the fantasy waiver wire addition of the entire year. Week 10, 32.7 points. Week 11, 21.1 points. Week 12, 21 points. Week 13, 24.4 points. Throughout that stretch between weeks 10 and week 13, he was a top 3 receiver in fantasy football. Throughout that stretch, he has scored 7 touchdowns. He has been on absolute fire. Obviously missed him a lot last week on bye week, and a really important week for a lot of you guys in terms of making the playoffs or determining top seed in your guys' respective fantasy leagues. But nonetheless, he is back here in week 15. He gets the Rams, the 9th worst team against the wide receiver position from a fantasy perspective. And the advantage here is that although Jalen Ramsey does tend to kind of float at the cornerback position, you still have Allen Lazard taking some of that defensive pressure from Ramsey as well. So there should be plenty of plays where Watson is going to be able to do his thing. He doesn't need a ton of targets. He doesn't need a ton of receptions. We look at that stretch where he's been absolutely balling. He has 4 or less receptions in each of those 4 games, which is absolutely crazy when you really break down the stats and how many of his receptions have been touchdowns in those 4 games. Nonetheless, Watson is a beautiful flex option. You know, the way that you were more than likely able to pick him up on the waiver wire this year, you probably have a primary wide receiver 1 and 2 already in your lineup, but don't be afraid to move Watson up to a primary starter to finish out the year. You get the Miami Dolphins in week 16 and the Minnesota Vikings in week 17, but most importantly here in week 15, he's got a great matchup against a bad Rams secondary. And don't forget, the Packers are going to need to keep things as competitive as possible. They have to win out to have a shot at the playoffs. So this is going to be a game where Aaron Rodgers is going to be slinging the football around. I really can't emphasize how much I love Christian Watson as a start as we move into week 15. All right, last but not least, I've got Chris Olave of the Saints going up against the Atlanta Falcons, the team that allows the 5th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. In Olave's last 3 games, he's had 62 or more receiving yards. You know, it's worth noting that while overall in the season, the Falcons have played really poorly against the wide receiver position, AJ Terrell missed a little bit of time and he is back and healthy. He is a great corner on this team. He is going to line up against Chris Olave, I would assume, for most of this game, but just due to the sheer volume alone, I'll still give Olave a must start here. I think he's a really solid flex option. I wouldn't be too scared of benching him in this matchup. Not necessarily an important matchup for either team, but I do think this is a game where, you know, both the defenses could potentially go out the window because there's not a lot to play for. And we look at the season as a whole, Olave only has 2 games that he started where he has less than 5 targets. He has just been a volume machine. He has at least 6 targets in his last 3 games. Just overall, especially in full PPR leagues, I think Chris Olave is absolutely worth a flex as we approach the first round of the fantasy playoffs. That'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button. Of course, if you are new to the channel, it really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing, and please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. Whatever you guys need, any position, I want to help you guys get that win here in the first round of the playoffs and help you guys advance to your fantasy championship. So please let me know what you guys need and be on the lookout for our next fantasy Q&A live stream. We would love to have you guys there. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening, and remember, you saw it here on The Catch.